Adonai roi lo etsar Dino deshe yarbiteni Ame menuchot Yenaleni Nafshi yeshovev yeshovev Yancheni b'maglei tzedek Yancheni b'maglei tzedek Leman shemo Am ki elech degei tzamabet Lo ira ki ata imadi shiftecha u'mishe'antecha ema yenachamuni Tarot lepanai shochan neged zorerai Tishanta v'shemen roshi kosi revaya Ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni Oyemei chayai Shavti b'beit Adonai le'orech yamim Adonai roi lo echsar Adonai roi lo echsar Mizmor David, a psalm of David. Begin with these words of our tradition, Psalm 23. In so doing, we connect our beloved Rabbi Kassel, Abelson, to the 3,000-year-old tradition of the Jewish people in the eternity of God. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. God makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters, restoring my soul and guiding me in straight paths for God's name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me, God. Your rod and your staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. I shall dwell in the house of Adonai forever. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, our God and God of our ancestors, 1,000 years in your sight are but a passing day, an hour of night. Dor holech v'dor ba, generations come and go while you, God, endure forever. We are always biadecha, we are in your hands, Adonai, in death as in life. Help us who mourn passes death to look beyond this moment, to realize that it cannot destroy everlasting bonds of love. Sustain us with the knowledge afforded by emunah, by faith, that you will not allow us to be forgotten. For you, Eternal One, have taught us Orach Chaim, the way of life. In you we gain eternity. Amen. How do you write a eulogy for the person who literally wrote the book on eulogies? In 2005, Rabbi Abelson and a colleague, Rabbi Elkins, wrote a book called The Eulogy Book that taught rabbis how to write eulogies. It was a helpful tool to new rabbis like me. But more than teaching rabbis how to properly eulogize and mourn the dead, Rabbi Abelson taught all of us how to live. In 2015, well into his retirement, he gave a lecture at the Knollwood Apartments where he was living at the time called How Judaism Deals with Death and Dying. In it, he said, the Jewish approach to death is to look back to the present and to retain the memories of the deceased, but also to look to the future and to continue to live a meaningful life in the present. He continued, while I affirm the importance of the world to come, whatever role I will someday play in it, will be affected by the sort of person I am and have been in this world. Today we gather to look back over the past, over the life of Rabbi Kassel Abelson, to look back and admire the person that he was and celebrate his many accomplishments. Even as we look back over his life, we're called upon to look forward to our own. Doing so, we painfully acknowledge the void left in the wake of his death, as well as all the ways that he will forever remain with us, the ways he will continue to influence us. For he taught us how to honor the dead by living a meaningful life in the present. In these days of the Hebrew month of Av, this time of national mourning for the Jewish people, our individual and our communal joy is diminished with the death of Rabbi Kassel Abelson. We extend condolences to Cass's beloved family, to his children David and Susan, Lisa and Rick and Sam and Sharon, his many, many loving grandchildren and great-grandchildren, relatives, and friends. As we gather, I want to acknowledge the many rabbis who were his students and his colleagues, along with members of the Minnesota Rabbinical Association who are here. I want to acknowledge the many people joining us virtually from around the world who have joined to honor their dear friend and rabbi and to express their condolences to you, his beloved family. Today, even amidst the grief, there is gratitude. Kass himself was someone who never hesitated to express his gratitude. Like anyone who lived so long, he knew loss in his life, but he remained grateful for his lot. Indeed, in recent years and months, every time his caregivers came, he thanked them sincerely and profusely. Today, we offer our special thanks to Elisa and Rick. For years, Kass wintered in your Florida home, and when COVID arrived, he moved there permanently. Never looking for accolades, you showed your Abba great kavod, honor, that allowed him to age with the dignity he so deserved. To David, to Elisa and Sam and your family, we extend not only our condolences, but our profound gratitude for sharing your Abba with us. Your Abba loved you and your family with such a deep and enduring love. And in his eyes, Bethel was family too. In some cases, quite literally, he became a foster parent and a second father to children in the congregation. Rabbi Abelson shared his love with the congregation, and so undoubtedly there were times too numerous to count when you would have wanted him all to yourself. The words "thank you" hardly seem to be enough, but we say them from the bottom of our heart. And to Rabbi Abelson himself, we are incredibly grateful, in ways too numerous to count, for being our rabbi. And our friend. We read in Pirkei Avot, "Aseh lecha rav, uknei lecha chaver." Make for yourself a rabbi, acquire a friend. In Rabbi Abelson, Rav and Chaver were one and the same to congregants and colleagues alike. Rav. Rabbi Abelson was a rabbi's rabbi. He inspired young adults to enter the rabbinate not as a career, but as a calling. He guided and mentored those already serving in the field and took great pride in their accomplishments. For some of us, he was first and foremost a rabbi. He told me to call him Cass, but to me, he was always Rabbi Abelson. There is Rav, and then there is Chaver. As much as he was Rabbi Abelson, the quintessential pulpit rabbi who devoted himself to shepherding his flock, to many he was Cass. Congregants were friends with whom he socialized and traveled. As he grew older, those relationships grew deeper and closer. Rav, Chaver. Rabbi Abelson's assistant rabbis became lifelong friends. In some cases, more than just friends, it was family. At this time, I'd like to invite his Chaver and his Chavruta, Rabbi Haim Herring, forward to share some of his personal reflections.
Eulogizing Rabbi Abelson, Harav Cantorial ben Harav Gershon Vilea, is real and yet still feels very surreal. We knew this day must come, but knowing it doesn't make the profundity of our loss any easier. Here in this Bethel sanctuary, Rabbi Abelson gave thousands of sermons and B'nai Mitzvah charges, wedding talks, and Shabbat and Yom Tov Divrei Torah. And now we are here mourning a profound loss for the Abelson family, the Bethel family, the conservative movement, the broader Jewish community, and indeed the civic community where he was so active earlier in his rabbinate. David and Susan, Elisa and Rick, Sam and Sharon, I am profoundly grateful for giving me an invitation to give one of the eulogies. It is both an honor and an impossibility, for I believe that your Abba, your Saba, and your Saba Ravta had one of the longest and most influential rabbinates nationally and internationally from the middle of the last century and continuing into this century as well. Some of my memories of Rabbi Abelson will resonate with the many colleagues who have come out to honor him today and who are participating throughout the world online. I see at least one of Cass's kids, that early group of Torah readers who became pioneers and many who went on to be rabbis in their own right, Rabbi Jim Rosen. I also see several of my predecessor, former assistant rabbis. I see Rabbi Sack is here, Rabbi Starr is here, and I also speak not only for the many rabbis who were influenced by Rabbi Abelson, but out of a deep and unusually close personal relationship that I shared with him for almost 40 years. He frequently said, "Chaim, remember your mishpacha." Rabbi Abelson always selected a text to anchor his remarks, and one that immediately came to mind when I heard about his passing is found in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Talmud Torah, chapter 5, number 1. This teaching deals with the question of whose honor precedes whom, a father or a rabbi who has been a master teacher. And the halakha is undisputed in this point. The honor due one's master rabbinic teacher exceeds that due one's father, for his father brings him into the life of this world, while his master rabbinic teacher brings him into the world to come. V'rabo shelimdo chochma mivio l'chayei olam haba. My father passed away this past Yom Kippur, and my mother 1 month later, and I miss them very much, and I'm grateful for bringing me into this world. But Rabbi Abelson taught me the meaning of Torah, transformed me into a rabbi, and indeed, a much better human being. Like so many of my colleagues, I have lost my rabbi, for whom I owe immeasurable kavod for developing my understanding of a certain kind of Jewish way of life that he described to me as modern traditional Judaism. But I've lost so much more, as have my colleagues. We have lost a Gadol Hador, someone who is an exceptional teacher, a renowned scholar of his generation. And I think many of us consider ourselves as his disciples. Now, in the rabbinic tradition, a disciple has a very specific meaning. A disciple is someone who has internalized the gestalt of his rabbi. This disciple eventually will come into his own, but the underlying values of his master rabbinic teacher pulse through him, and there is a direct line of continuity between rabbi and disciple. So when I first met Rabbi Abelson, I was finishing a year of post-rabbinic studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I was applying to be assistant rabbi at Bethel. My wife, Terry, knew of Bethel from her teen years. Coming from Lincoln, Nebraska, Minneapolis was the big city, and she used to spend some Shabbatot here and sometimes at the Abelson home around the Shabbat table. My dear friend and colleague, we were students together in rabbinical school, Rabbi Jim Rosen, who grew up in this congregation, pulled me aside one day when we were visiting and said, "You know, Chaim, you should really think about applying to Bethel." He spoke so glowingly about Rabbi Abelson, as every other colleague did. For everyone at JTS knew him and spoke of him with great admiration and respect. And of course, I was intimidated by our first meeting. I thought he would be some imposing kind of figure, and here I was, just a newly minted rabbi. We met, and Rabbi Abelson asked me a question. I remember this. This was from 1984. He asked me, "What is the difference between a congregant and a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary?" I gave the obvious answer with the feeling that I was going to be very wrong. And then he answering that the professor knows so much more Torah. I mean, it really caught me off guard, that kind of question. And he said, no, there is no difference. Every person has the same human needs, and at one point in their lives, they will need a rabbi. In that very brief first encounter, Rabbi Abelson reminded me that every Jew, and indeed every person, shares the same inherent worth and is entitled to the same human dignity. And as Rabbi Abelson's fourth assistant, I watched him live out this value day in and day out. He was never dazzled by wealth, power, or intellect, nor disparaged those who had less or who had lesser intellectual capacities. Everyone received the same equal attention and care. And even in our private meetings, I never heard him once belittle another person. So I had two formal interviews with the search committee. The first was in January of 1985 when I think we set a record of 34 below zero. Honestly, I didn't think I was going to live after that. And I guess I was kind of a meshugana because I came back for a final interview in March when it snowed 15 inches. So what would persuade me, coming from the East Coast, being a hardcore Easterner, to come to this exotic place that I couldn't even find on a map, which I didn't have? I literally had to take out the U volume of my Encyclopedia Judaica to find where Minnesota was, and then the M volume to locate Minneapolis. So why did I come here? Because I knew that I needed experience, and there was no one better to provide that for me than Rabbi Abelson. So in 1985, Terry and I went to what for me was a very exotic location for what I believe would be 3 years, and then, like any rational person, would return to the East Coast. Now, Bethel owned a home for assistant rabbis on Raleigh Avenue that Rabbi Abelson had dubbed the Rabbinage, and it wasn't ready for us to move in. So, of course, he invited us to live with him for 3 weeks until it was ready. He couldn't have been more gracious, again, teaching by example what it meant to live out the value of Hachnasat Orchim, of welcoming those who were guests. Now, before we arrived in Minneapolis, I think it was Rabbi Barry Starr who forewarned me, Chaim, you're going to visit someone in the hospital. You're going to finish, and they're going to say, thank you, Rabbi, when's the rabbi coming? And by that, he meant the real rabbi of Bethel Synagogue, for there was only one, and that was Rabbi Abelson. Admittedly, it took me a number of years, as my colleague Rabbi Davis said, to begin to feel a little bit less intimidated by him and to call him by his first name, Cass. And I watched in awe when I first came here how literally the last word before any significant decision was Rabbi Abelson's. He let everyone freely express their own opinion when a decision had to be made, and his word was the last one that was often the one that was followed. I never saw him coerce anyone, but only educate and persuade until they arrived at the right conclusion. Now, I'm very lucky that Rabbi Abelson did not send me packing home back east, but was instead willing to mentor a barely 27-year-old rabbi with little practical experience. I guarantee you if I had been in his shoes, I would not have hired me. Here's a vignette illustrating his patience with this new rabbi. For my first Purim, Cass came in his usual costume, a sport jacket, tie, and then he reached for some old totes hat hidden on the shelf in the robing room and put it atop his head, and that was his Purim costume. I had other ideas. I visited Teeners, and I asked Jerry Teener for a certain kind of religious costume that I had in mind. So in I march, dressed as a nun, as Cass was adjusting his totes hat. Cass looked at me, and knowing that he was caught between a teachable moment and not wanting to embarrass me, thought for a second and said, "Just don't make a habit out of it." Message received. Unlike my peers who are assistant rabbis elsewhere, Rabbi Abelson gave great latitude to his assistants to learn, to grow, and to make mistakes. And he supported us when we did, even in the presence of a complaining congregant, but then quietly took us aside, discussed the matter with us, and later on, we were making a phone call or meeting with that congregant to make sure that there was shalom bayit, something that was such an essential part of who Rabbi Abelson was. And he was so innovative. That's why he allowed us to be innovative. The conservative movement's teen programs, Camp Ramah and USY, were his brainchildren. And not only that, Rabbi Abelson raised money for a scholarship fund for Camp Ramah, making sure that those who wanted to go but might not afford it could do so. He had this knack of pulling young kids aside. He was like a talent scout for the Jewish community and suggesting to them that they consider attending Camp Ramah. As an assistant rabbi, one of my portfolios was the USY chapter. And of course, we got stuck in a blizzard during the first time I attended Chinus. I think it was somewhere in Iowa, if race, I don't know. Not quite making it to Kansas City, but that was because he valued the importance of youth. It wasn't just lip service. It was critical to the Jewish future for him. During the summertime, I would drive to visit Bethel's kids at Camp Ramah, as Cantor Newman did, and to the Hillel at Madison with a cooler full of food. Rabbi Abelson created a real camaraderie with his staff, and unlike some very unfortunate congregations, he and Cantor Newman were close colleagues and friends, and not adversaries. And that too was an expression of Shalom Bayit. Egalitarian Judaism, which he wrote a response about, was one of his deep principles. And even while there was resistance here at Bethel, sometimes among our staff, he really laid out a firm plan about how we would proceed. He was a trailblazer in kashrut, relying upon a congregant who was a food chemist to help him understand how new additives might affect a kosher product. When the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which he had chaired for many years, was asked to render a legal response to homosexuality in Judaism, they turned to Rabbi Abelson. Knowing the acute sensitivities on both sides of the issues, his colleagues on the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards knew that they needed someone who was universally respected for their honesty and integrity. Rabbi Abelson did not have to accept this role. He chose to lead the process because he loved the conservative movement and did not want to see it split over this issue. And that's not only my assessment. Rabbi Elliot Dorff, distinguished professor of philosophy, legal scholar, and former chair of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, wrote to his son-in-law, Rabbi Rick Sherwin, Cass was a remarkably steady hand as we took 3 years to discuss, really debate, homosexuality between 2003 and 2006. I really think he kept the movement together. After I left Bethel, which I knew was difficult for him, we actually became closer. Over our many lunches at Panera, and I remember his order by heart, it was tuna in either a sandwich or a salad, hazelnut coffee with one sweetener, and of course, a chocolate chip cookie. He encouraged and supported me through all of my rabbinic transitions. He always was interested in hearing what I was working on and said, you know, Chaim, if I were younger, I would probably be doing this kind of work. And his blessing helped me grow through each rabbinic transition. Those were some of my richest years with Rabbi Abelson. What a treasure it was to hear from a legal scholar, a giant of the movement, and to be able to ask his advice on either my next book or some new initiative that I was working on when I was executive director of a National Synagogue Foundation. I knew that Rabbi Abelson would always give me honest feedback, and his feedback was usually very helpful. Sadly, Rabbi Abelson's wife and partner in all things, Shirley, had recently passed away before we moved to Minneapolis. She was his soulmate and standard bearer for the role of Rebbitzin par excellence. And her presence was still very palpable when Terry and I came to Bethel. Now, preachers' kids aren't always fond of rabbis, but my son and daughter, Avi and Tamar, were always ready to join Rabbi Abelson and Joan Abelson for a Shabbat or holiday meal. Terry always made chocolate chip cookies, which he gladly accepted, and around that table there was love and laughter and spirited conversation for a Shabbat meal. Now, Terry and I didn't even realize the impact that he had upon our children until we spoke with them with the sad news that Rabbi Abelson had passed away. Avi remembered how Rabbi Abelson always asked him, tell me, what are you learning now? Tell me what's new. And Tamar told me that she never even realized what a legend he was because he was so humble and down to earth. Now, Tamar had one very special early memory of him when he was at our Shabbat table, which coincided with her third or fourth birthday. Rabbi Abelson had come over that Shabbat on her birthday, and Tamar's friends were dressed up in a themed ballerina costume wearing tutus. Tamar turned to Terry and whispered in her ear, do you think that Rabbi Abelson can wear a tutu? That was a question I'm sure that he had never been asked before. But already at 3 or 4 years old, Rabbi Abelson was her friend. By about 2013, Rabbi Abelson knew it was time to move to Knollwood because it was simply too difficult to take care of a large home. He was prepared for the move, but surprised by the lack of social engagement at Knollwood. So of course, what did he do? He taught one of his favorite books, Pirkei Avot, where he would teach about the stories of the Avot and Imahot, the patriarchs and matriarchs, and tell me later, after he had gained a new insight with excitement, you know, I never saw that before. Rabbi Abelson never outgrew his love for Torah because he let Torah grow through him. His eager and open mind yielded new insights as he aged. Now, sometime shortly after Rabbi Abelson moved into Knollwood, we began studying together. And of course, at first I had to stop at Panera for hazelnut coffee with one sweetener and a chocolate chip cookie. We studied the Parsha of the week unless there was some other burning issue like Israel. He was an ardent Zionist, not an uncritical one, but he remembered what it was like for there not to be a Jewish state. Another mutual friend and Knollwood resident, Harold Smith, who also recently passed away, heard that we were studying and wanted to be included in our Chevruta, so Cass and I took a vote, and we told Harold it was a little close, but we decided that he could join us. Now, only a couple of years ago, imagine this, when Rabbi Abelson was 97 years old, and I believe Harold was 102 years old, I had posed an ethical question to them, and boy, did they debate. When Cass realized that they weren't going to reach agreement, he looked directly at Harold and said, "Harold, what do I know? Compared to you, I'm just a kid." At all stages of life, Rabbi Abelson craved intellectual stimulation. He was learned and an ongoing learner and an engaging teacher. His goal was to leave people with at least a new Jewish text, a new insight, or a new idea. And until very recently, Cass and I studied, facilitated by my dear friend and colleague with Rabbi Rick Sherwin, and now we had formed another chevruta. It was Rabbi Rick and Cass and me, and often one of his grandsons, Davi. I mean, that was so typical of Cass, bringing generations together. Like many colleagues who were privileged to spend time with him, I frequently hear the echo of his voice when thinking about mundane and significant matters. I may not consciously ask myself, what approach would Rabbi Abelson take to a complex issue? But I know that his Jewish wisdom guides me. I remember his many aphorisms that gave a window into his core Jewish beliefs. Don't be wasteful, which I think he told me his mother used to say to him. Put people before principles. Chaim, there's nothing more important than shalom bayit. Sei a mensch, and most importantly, be a mensch. I learned about resilience and faith in the future from Rabbi Abelson, watching how he gracefully accepted some painful portions of his life without complaint while looking forward and ahead to the future. Even as his own health was declining, my phone would ring and I would hear a voice that sounded like Leonard Cohen with a Brooklyn accent, asking, "How are you, Chaim? Tell me how you're feeling. How is Terry? How are the children?" His regular calls, which Rick facilitated, sustained me through this difficult period. And while I will miss them very much, I have acquired a new friend in Rick. Rabbi Abelson's many grandchildren and great-grandchildren showered him with love, and his children, David and Susan, Sam and Sharon, and Elisa and Rick, lovingly fulfilled the mitzvah of kibud av, of honoring one's parent. He was so grateful to them, for gratitude was one of his hallmarks. Elisa and Rick, I understand the total commitment required to care for a once vibrant parent who is now in decline. You placed your father's needs, your Abba's needs before yours. It was a total commitment, and you helped him retain his dignity until his dying day. You extended his life, and you gave him purpose. My last book, Connecting Generations, Bridging the Boomer, Gen X, and Millennial Divide, I had an interview that I conducted with Rabbi Abelson about transitions of aging. I don't know about the rest of the book, but that interview makes the book worthwhile reading. And I also had the zchut, the privilege, of dedicating it to two people. One was my granddaughter, Liba, who had recently been born, and the other was to Rabbi Abelson, who was about 95 years old at that time. Here's a part of the dedication. Referring to Rabbi Abelson, I wrote, in the Jewish tradition, we're taught that we have biological parents and spiritual parents, teachers who shape our souls and character. We recognize that while we may not be able to accomplish as much as our spiritual parents, they inspire us to do more than we think and more than we're capable of achieving. The path that we pursue will invariably differ from our spiritual parents, but they also endow us with confidence because their values strengthen us to live with purpose, develop enriching relationships, and strive to make our communities better. Since 1985, Rabbi Abelson has been my mentor, teacher, and spiritual parent. And when I read about ancient rabbinic sages from the past whose humility masked their dedication and service to their communities, I realize that some of them still live among us today. So I dedicate this book also to my spiritual parent, Rabbi Cass Abelson. Liba, you're now about 9 months old, and Rabbi Abelson is approaching 95. Rabbi Abelson is a member of the greatest generation, meaning that he was born before 1928. Liba, your generation has yet to be given a name, but the two of you make a perfect pairing in a book dedication about intergenerational communities and locating the common tasks of each generation. In addition to the many positive attributes you'll gain from being part of a wonderful family, my prayer is that I will be able to transmit in some measure Rabbi Abelson's kindness and goodness in relating to all people, regardless of background, as reflections of God's image. Now we close a different kind of book, of a long and purposeful life who brought out the best in all of us. Rabbi Abelson would often conclude the words of a eulogy with the phrase that a great scholar ended when completing a holy work. Tam v'nishlam shevach le'el elyon. This work is complete and whole. Praise to God for enabling me to finish it. I thank God for enabling me to be a part of the rich book about a meaningful life that was Rabbi Abelson's. And I know that Rabbi Abelson touched so many and they feel the same. And I thank Rabbi Abelson's family for allowing me to share how I and so many colleagues feel. Tam v'nishlam shevach le'el elyon, zecher tzadik livracha. May our memories of Rabbi Abelson, a kind, a righteous, and a wise person, continue to inspire the members of his large and loving family, his many rabbinic colleagues, and the thousands of people he has touched here at Bethel and throughout the Jewish world. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Herring, for those beautiful and personal words. Rabbi Abelson developed a deep relationship, not just with his assistant rabbis, but all of the staff and officers of the synagogue. He worked closely with presidents and the board members and formed strong partnership and deep friendship. He was particularly close, as you heard, with the cantors over the years. Cantor Abrams and Tisser are sad that they cannot be with us this morning. Cantor Newman asked that I share these words on his behalf. Sarah and I are so saddened at the passing and loss of our dear rabbi and friend, Cass Abelson. Since we are in Europe at this time, we regret not being able to be with the family and the entire Bethel community, all of you who are mourning together at this difficult time. Here are but a few fond memories of my working with Cass and our friendship over the years. First to mind was our interview weekend at Bethel during the Pesach holiday of 1979. It was so very cold that late April that the holiday seemed totally out of touch with nature. But then again, it was Minnesota, and Rabbi A assured me, as he lent me an appropriate winter coat, that the winters, although longer than in most places, were, quote, truly invigorating. The warmth and hospitality, however, showered on me by Cass and Shirley Aleim Shalom that weekend and beyond, both so real and genuine. And the love and caring of the two of them displayed for each other made me feel comfortable enough to be in their presence and to seriously consider spending the rest of my cantorial career and life in Minneapolis. Rabbi A and I enjoyed mutual respect for one another, making it comfortable enough for me to reach out to members of the synagogue at good times and bad, and allowing me to grow professionally from year to year. Until I arrived at Bethel, I had never met or worked with a rabbi who loved a community in the way Rabbi A did. It's no secret that Cass possessed few musical skills. He had a habit of recommending members to join the Bethel choir who, like himself, could not carry a tune at all. But he and I had an unwritten agreement that we would nevertheless stand together at the Aron HaKodesh to remove and return the Sefer Torah and to sing together. Luckily, I developed a special skill of hearing pitches only on my right side as he stood on my left. Cass was a person committed to peace. He always sought consensus from members of the staff and from others, and he possessed an uncanny ability to effect compromise and to bring people together in so many different settings. I had tremendous respect for this skill. Finally, our relationship was not just collegial. The two of us enjoyed a beautiful and lengthy friendship that continued all through his and my own retirement. And I thoroughly appreciated our weekly phone conversations from a distance. For that, I will be forever grateful. Sarah and I extend our heartfelt condolences to Rabbi A's family and to the entire Bethel family as well. For over 40 years, Rabbi Abelson worked with our choir director, Bill Torador. This too was more than a working relationship, it was a friendship. I've asked Bill to come forward and share with us a tefillah that in many ways defines Bethel. L'dor Vador speaks to that sense of continuity that was certainly fostered by Rabbis Aronson and Abelson's tenure, which together covered the rich 100-year history of this congregation. But it wasn't just a matter of length of years. The continuity comes from the fact that traditions and specific programs continue these many years later. It comes from the fact, as past President Bonnie Heller likes to point out, the values that were there at the beginning continue to animate and guide us. As we join together, we are invited not only to reflect back on previous generations, on the years that have gone by, but on the generations and years still yet to come, and on our individual responsibility to ensure our Jewish values and traditions will be passed on midor lador. In that way, while this moment does mark in some ways the end of an era, it will simultaneously also be continuation.
Sing with me, okay? Le dor vador, le dor vador, le dor vador, nani god leva, ulen netzach netzachim, ulen netzach netzachim, kedushat ha-nadish, Ledor vador, ledor vador, ledor vador, nagi god lecha, ulenetzach netzachim, ulenetzach netzachim, kedushat ha-anish. ושבחך אלוהינו, אם לא ימוש לעולם ועד, כי אל מלך גדול, כי אל מלך גדול, וקדוש אתה, לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור, נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים, ולנצח נצחים, קדושת הנביא.
I'm told that when Rabbi Abelson's first grandchild, Danny, was born, Bethel changed. All of a sudden, it was permissible to have kids up on the bima and running around in the halls. Just don't let Mr. Gottesman catch you. Cass so loved being a Saba and Saba Rabba, it brought him endless nachas. Indeed, if asked, he would say that they were his greatest legacy. For all the time that Cass devoted to community, he always made time solely dedicated to family. This was Zman Kodesh. He loved going to Meryl and Chris's on Friday nights to celebrate Shabbat with 4 generations at the table. He elicited conversations with his great-grandchildren, remembering from week to week their activities and marveling at their growth month to month. On Shabbat, after officiating at services in the morning, afternoon was time for family, time for his phone calls. Cass called friends and relatives every week to check in, 30 to 40 calls each Shabbat that stretched 2 to 3 hours. For Cass, calling loved ones, that made Shabbat holy. It was his Mikra Kodesh. At this time, I'd like to invite Dan and Sean, 2 of his grandchildren, to come forward to share some of their cherished memories.
Well, I have the same musical talents as my grandfather, so I'm not going to sing. But instead of talking about the Rav or the Chaver, I'm going to talk about my Saba and how he was there through the lives of me and my family through 47 years. So my earliest memories of Saba are from right here and running up to meet him on the bima at the end of services and jumping into his arms. Some of the most cherished memories from childhood with Saba are the Saturday afternoons we spent together. I'd go to his house after synagogue, we'd play catch, watch Doctor Who episodes that he taped on his old VCR, explore his collection of 1950s science fiction books, talk. He also tried many times, and unsuccessfully, but patiently, to teach me chess. I remember him giving a speech to me in my bar mitzvah, which may be the last time I was up here. And it was like he had done for so many other bar mitzvahs. And I remember thinking in my head, he was mentioning a point in my Haftorah from the book of Jeremiah. And all I could do was to try and not laugh, because going through my head was the song Jeremiah wasn't. But I also remember thinking more seriously how my Saba presiding at my bar mitzvah was both completely ordinary for him as a rabbi, something he'd done thousands of times before, and incredibly special as a grandfather. Many years later, when I told him that I was dating my now wife, Alyssa, he very subtly asked, "What is her last name?" But he could not contain his joy when he heard Moskowitz. He didn't need follow-up questions. And then several months later, on one of our Saturday afternoon phone calls, I was very nervous to tell him that Alyssa and I were going to move in together. I wasn't quite sure what his reaction was going to be. And while I can't recall his exact response, the gist of it was clear, which was, as a rabbi, I'm supposed to say I don't approve of people moving in together before marriage, but she's Jewish, so it's okay. Then, a few years later, Saba performed our wedding ceremony. Now, he did insist that we find someone else to chant the blessings. We did. But it meant so much to have him perform the ceremony. And I could see how much it meant to him to perform the wedding ceremony of his first grandchild. So to use one of his terms, I could see how it filled him with nachas. He also was very diplomatic when he didn't approve of the language in our ketubah. He looked at our ketubah, and apparently it had the reform language. So his solution was, he asked us to sign 2 ketubahs, the one that we chose, and the rabbinical assembly approved form conservative ketubah. And he told us we could take that form ketubah and just put it in a drawer, but that it was important to him to know that we'd signed that version as well. So we did. I feel incredibly fortunate that my children, who are 16 and 13, were able to get to know Saba so well. From Saba getting on the floor to play with him when they were toddlers, to regular Friday night dinners at my mom's, to just a few weeks ago, hearing this excitement in his voice when my older son, Zach, told him about college visits. Saba's love, care, and concern for my younger child, George, when George came out as transgender, was incredibly touching. He not only immediately accepted George, but compassionately worked to understand what it meant for George in his life. Certainly not the thing you might expect when you're talking to somebody in their late 90s. But to him, he understood and accepted. Now I just want to share a few words from my wife and my children. So Alyssa says, so my most cherished memories are drives to and from Knollwood for Shabbat dinner. Sometimes we were accompanied by the little chattering voices of his great-grandchildren, Zach and George, but more often than not, it was just the 2 of us discussing our weeks and catching up about family. I always made it a point to share the antics of the kids, and on all those trips, he expressed his love for his family and always had a few puns thrown in the conversation. Shortly after my grandfather passed away, during one of our weekly Shabbat trips, Saba asked if I was okay. He correctly noticed that I was quieter than usual, and I shared that I missed my grandfather. It meant a lot to me how he asked how I was doing. He again shared his love of his family. So, from Zach, my first memories of Saba were when I was very young, and on Sundays he would come to our house with John. I don't remember much from then, but I remember that he would draw and read with me, and occasionally we would play outside too. All of my more recent memories of Saba were great as well. Saba was really great at listening and noticing, even if it didn't seem like he was paying attention. This was especially clear at the Shabbat table, when he would jump into the conversation with a clever pun only he could think of, and sometimes mixing in Yiddish. This trait also showed up in more serious ways, like when he would notice if something wasn't quite right or someone wasn't feeling well, and he would ask about it. And George shared that I enjoyed playing checkers with Saba, even though he always won. And Saba always had a pun to share.
I think the last time I was up here, I know the last time I was up here was for my bar mitzvah, having flashbacks. I'll try not to start chanting Torah, though I do think Saba would be proud of that I still remember. Thank you, Bill, for that as well. I grew up less than a mile from here. To me, everything was local. My cousins lived on the next block. My grandpa, Cass, and his wife, Joan, lived just around the corner, and Bethel, where he was the local rabbi, was walking distance. My world at that time was relatively small. At 18, I spent some time in Jerusalem and took college classes, including one called Jewish Medical Ethics. As I opened the textbook, I was confused to see my name at the top of one of the sections, my last name. Turns out Saba, Rabbi Abelson, had written the section on the textbook about reproductive rights in Judaism. The next semester, I found he wrote the chapter on the Jewish response to suicide and burial rights as well. My understanding of Saba as a local rabbi was wrong, very wrong. As I found out quickly, he led the Rabbinical Assembly and spent time as the chair for the Committee on Jewish Laws and Standards. I had no idea he drafted so many decisions and voted on or ratified by the Assembly affecting how conservative Judaism is practiced globally. Since then, I have spent more time on rabbinical.assembly.org than I care to admit, reading his papers and official decisions to better understand his life and his leadership in the conservative Jewish movement. His substantial impact on the Jewish community became clear, but little did I know how many lives he would touch along the way. Around the same time, I was meeting more Jews from the US and from Israel and from around the world. I started to hear stories, more and more stories about Saba and Shirley's impact on specific people and families. I think we've heard a lot today as well. I cannot count the number of people who said he presided over their wedding, he bat mitzvahed them, or came to support them in particularly difficult times of their lives. Each story was filled with warmth and love for Saba. He helped individuals as a rabbi and a friend, and he helped the wider Jewish community through his thoughtful and influential leadership. When he wrote the decision, the Assembly's decision on abortion, it was not political or polarizing or popularist. It was focused on reducing suffering, especially during extremely difficult times. When the decision on burial rights and suicide was published, he made it clear that Judaism should provide full burial rights for grieving families. Imagine now, many decades later, how many families and people these decisions have helped. It is easy for people to accept the status quo, to keep things the way that they are, and to push back against change. Saba rarely took this easy way. He had a subtle and almost casual chutzpah, and frequently sought to challenge the status quo to create a wider tent and a more accepting conservative movement. He used his position as a rabbi and a leader in the Rabbinical Assembly to improve the lives of Jews and many others across the globe. I've read decision after decision with my Saba's name on it that helped make Judaism more inclusive, empowered Jewish women to choose the option of abortion under conservative Jewish law, opened the door for women to become rabbis, and expanded burial rights to families who lost a loved one to suicide. His sermons condemning segregation in the Deep South in the early 1950s led to concerns for his safety, while his opinions and votes 2 decades ago helped conservative Judaism begin to support the rights of transgender people. I'm proud to be able to say that Saba worked to make Judaism and the world more open and accepting for over 75 years. You can still read a lot of his writing online. The University of Minnesota has a full section of interviews, papers, opinions, and articles with him. Saba and Shirley and later Joan had such positive impacts on the lives of many of us. Several years after my time in Jerusalem, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in New York as a counselor. When I told him about it for the first time, he said, "Oh, I know that place. I helped establish it the first year they were opened. And I was a madrich there. I said, of course. I thought, why not? I bet he also created USY and other things as well. And turns out he did. Both of those and much more. And all of that happened years before my first memories of holidays spent with Saba. To this day, I have never beat the record 16 matzo balls I had in one sitting at Rosh Hashanah at Saba and Joan's house. Even then, especially then, it was clear his love was unconditional. You could talk to him about anything, especially difficult topics, without fear or judgment. He loved his family unconditionally. As I think we've heard, his family was large and extended far into the community as well. Saba loved connecting with family and staying in touch with friends as well. He was the glue that kept our family in Minnesota, Australia, England, South Africa, Israel, and many other states together. He would call friends and family, as we've heard, each Saturday like clockwork. The grandkids would compare where they were on the call list. I had the reliable 1 to 1:30 time slot each week, finishing lunch just in time for my phone to ring. Speaking of food, Saba would often be the last speaker here at Bethel and Yom Kippur before we went to break fast. I realize I may be another Abelson standing between all of you and food, so as Saba would always finish with, and what were probably his parting words to this congregation, I bid you farewell. Sei gesund, be well, do mitzvot, good deeds, and lead you out, stay in touch.
Thank you both for those beautiful words. I'm conscious that Rabbi Abelson taught that eulogy should be short, but on that score, Rabbi Abelson, you'll have to forgive me, because I want to return to, for just a few more moments, words that I shared with Rabbi Abelson over a decade ago, a tribute for him. I didn't realize at the time that these very words were the ones that Rabbi Abelson recommended that we share about a rabbi in his eulogy book, and they couldn't be more appropriate. Rabbi Shimon taught that a person wears 3 crowns: the crown of Torah, the crown of the priesthood, and the crown of royalty. Shlosha ketarim hem, keter Torah, v'keter kuhuna, v'keter malchut. The 3 things symbolize assets cherished by people: wisdom, lineage, and power. Now, many of us strive and struggle to wear just one. Rabbi Abelson, whose Hebrew name, Cantorial, means crown of God, wore all 3. Keter Torah. Rabbi Abelson, as we know, was a person who cherished and loved learning and instilled that trait in others. When Lisa was assigned a report for school, her Abba came home with 10 books and said, "Hey, read these." When she finished the report, he'd bring another stack of 10 books. "But I finished the report," she protested. "Well, you never stop learning," he responded. Not surprisingly, Saba and Saba Rabba supported his grandchildren and great-grandchildren that they might pursue higher education. David remembers his Abba giving him his first chemistry set, which inspired his eventual path to medicine. It remained an area of interest that they shared throughout the years, but really, what wasn't an area of interest for Cass? Well, there was at least one area. For his 7th birthday, Sam and a bunch of friends went to a Twins game. Cass took the Twins. Already by the end of the first inning, Cass had pulled out a copy of the Jerusalem Post. He ignored the game and probably ignored the kids as he read up on the latest from Israel. Cass had a sharp mind. He was a whiz at math. His family marveled at his ability to solve complex problems in his head, and his deductive reasoning led to his ability to turn words over and over again and fueled his penchant for puns. Called by the family Saba jokes, they often got a groan, but he continued unabated even in his senior years and even with dementia. Unfortunately for the family, he passed on this gift to Sam. After Keter Torah is Keter Kahuna. That refers to lineage, to yichus. Rabbi Abelson was the son of a rabbi and the grandfather of a rabbi. He was born in Brooklyn. His mother Elizabeth was a piano teacher, and his father George was a rabbi and teacher, his rabbi and teacher. Admittedly, Cass didn't like having to get up at 6 a.m. to study Hebrew with his dad before going to school, but he learned a lot from him. Growing up, he thought he might become a research chemist and then consider becoming a Hebrew professor until he found his passion and his calling, the rabbinate. He enrolled in JTS, where he studied among others, Mordechai Kaplan. Cass was attracted to Kaplan's teaching on Judaism as a civilization. He still believed in a personal God, and so never became a Reconstructionist. From Rabbi Aronson to Rabbi Abelson was passed down the tradition of blessing the congregation with Birkat Kohanim. At the end of services and under a chuppah, around the Shabbat table, Rabbi Abelson offered this blessing with a deep kavanah and great sincerity. Just as recently as a few weeks ago, when his dementia had advanced, he offered this blessing to Jesse and Lior, who were getting married in Yerushalayim. At the ketubah signing, the officiating rabbi opened up his laptop, and to everyone's surprise, there was Cass. But he was different. His family could tell that a switch had flipped. He was not just there as Saba. The rabbi so deeply ingrained in him came out. And with a strong, clear voice, he lifted his hands and called forth, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. There was not a dry eye in the house. Keter Torah, Keter Kuna, and Keter Malchut. The crown of kingship stands for power. Rabbi Abelson wielded great influence not by strong arming, but by persuasion, not with a bullet pulpy, but with wisdom and reason. Perhaps most significantly, he did so in his wonderfully gentle nature. He was tough without being mean, influential without becoming arrogant. In the face of conflict, he never got angry, he never saw the bad in others, and was always dan l'chafskut, gave people the benefit of the doubt. Rabbi Abelson wore his Keter Malchut. He was a gadol, a giant in our movement and for his family. But his greatness is not measured in the 33 cubic feet containing 45 boxes of his papers in the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives housed at the University of Minnesota Library. His greatness is found not only in the number of transformative programs like USY that he established, it's apparent in the love that he shared with his family, in the minds of all the learners he taught, the hearts of all the mourners he comforted, the smiles of all the USYers he sparked, the spirit of all the seekers he ignited, the souls of all the faithful he touched. For even as he worked on important policies and projects, when he spoke with you, he made you feel like you were the only one in the world that mattered. And that brings us back to these crowns. Rabbi Shimon tells of 3 crowns, crowns of learning, lineage, and power. But he concludes saying the crown of a good name surpasses them all. Keter Shem Tov Ole Al Gabehem. This crown includes and surpasses all the others, and it was Cantorial, Rabbi Abelson's most important, most prominent crown. He had a compassionate heart and a listening ear. He was a gentleman and a gentle man. So yes, Gadol Hador, and at the same time, Anav Mikol Adam, the most humble of men. He was a mensch. Chaverim, we might be tempted to leave it at that, saying, Rabbi Abelson's so wonderful. He lived such a good, long life. Yes, of course. There must be more to it. To honor the father and Saba Rabbah who taught us the importance of family, we're called upon to show additional love to our families. To honor the friend who made you feel like you mattered most, we are to deepen and extend our friendships. To honor the rabbi who taught us Torah for over 70 years, we are to continue studying and teaching Torah. To honor the rabbi who devoted himself to Jewish law, we're called upon to devote ourselves to Jewish living. To honor a rabbi who built and grew this synagogue, we are to support synagogues and strengthen Jewish communal institutions by participating, giving, and volunteering, and on and on and on. For a funeral, as Rabbi Abelson taught, is not simply about looking to the past, but learning from it how to live in the present. There was a moment every year when, in Rabbi Abelson's words, the past and the future merged to the present. Sean alluded to it moments ago. It is Ne'ilah, and again I stand before you, carrying on a tradition begun many years ago by Rabbi Herring of blessed memory after he retired and moved to the UJ where he taught. He moved to LA where he taught at the UJ. Each year, Rabbi Abelson said, this occasion provides an opportunity to not only say shalom alehitraot, goodbye until we see each other again, but also to put into words a thought to hold on to during the coming year. Thus, Rabbi Abelson began his final reflections at the end of Ne'ilah each and every year. He went on to share a message. It could be a message about studying Torah, voting in the national elections, about Israel, or the plight of poverty. Admittedly, the longer he spoke, the hungrier we got. But he always gave us a thought to chew on at our fast breaking and for the year to come. And then he would conclude, it's Ne'ilah time. The gates are closing. But remember that other gates are opening. And the corridor of life stretches out before you, offering new opportunities and new challenges. Time is short, so to paraphrase Garrison Keillor, sei gesund, be well, do mitzvot, good deeds, and lehitraot, stay in touch. Rabbi Abelson concluded, lehitraot, stay in touch. But for his family and for all of us on this day, our hope and our prayer is lehitraot. May we see you again. May we see you and sense you in the faces and character traits of your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. May we see you and sense you as we observe the traditions you taught us and uphold the values you instilled in us. May we see you and sense you when we teach Torah, we study Torah. May we see you and sense you when we make a thoughtful change that meets the needs of a new generation. May we see you and sense you when we bridge a divide with respect and understanding. May we see you and sense you when we turn members into friends and friends into family. With a slight lean in and a pregnant pause you had perfected, let us say, Amen. Please rise for El Mle Rachamim, the memorial prayer. El Mle Rachamim, Shochem Bamromim, Amtzei Menucha Nechona, Tacha Kanfei Shechina, Amalot Kiddushin Torin, Kezohar Araki Amasirim, Et Nishmat Moreinu V'Rabbeinu, Katriel Ben Gershon Belea Shalach L'Olamo, Began Eden Temenuchato, Anna Balarachamim, Astirehu Besecha Kanafech Le'Olamin, Utzror B'Tzorachem Et Nishmato, Adonai Hu Nachalato, Be'anuach B'Shalom HaMishkavo, V'Nomar Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure to the soul of Kassel Abelson, who has gone to his eternal home. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace, May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. May he rest in peace. Let us say. Friends and family are encouraged to perform the mitzvah of Nichum Avilim, of offering comfort to the mourners, in part by attending tonight's public Shiva Minyan here at Bethel at 7 o'clock. There will be a private family interment immediately following this service. As Rabbi Abelson leaves the sanctuary and the synagogue for the last time, I'd like to invite those rabbis in the congregation to follow the family pallbearers and ask for our past presidents to follow after the rabbis to accompany the Aron out to the hearse.
Shamayim ba'aretz, hayitem lamot ragecha,